Hello and a very warm welcome to this latest edition of Talking Germany, the show where we do just that. And my guest today has been described as Germany's leading illustrator, or better still, as an international Grand Master of illustration. And here he is, the Grand Master in person, Christoph Niemann.
Great to be here.
That sounds good, doesn't it, Grand Master?
Sounds great.
You're not going to complain about that, no. Christoph Niemann's work has appeared in many influential American publications like the New York Times, Wired magazine and the New Yorker, but also here in Germany, for instance, in the prestigious magazine supplement of Die Zeit newspaper. He's a man who can be very funny and very serious, and I'm sure he's going to be a great guest. Christoph, I've had a wonderful, wonderful week, I have to tell you, because I've been exploring your world, the books and the blogs and the apps and all the little films. And I've had moments of laughter, I've had tears in my eyes. And I'm going to put the tears aside for just a moment and begin with the laughter. I'd like to ask you how important humour is to you.
Humor is extremely important, and not necessarily because I think, oh, laughing is healthy. It's a fantastic communication device. I think it allows us to tell a story, to kind of like go beyond expectations, because the whole idea of humor is to kind of like disappoint expectations. To set, every joke is set up, you have a certain kind of situation that causes a certain expectation, and then you mess with that in an absurd, funny, weird way. And I think that's often how you can actually break through to a reader.
You're describing how who you are and what you do and the impact you try to have. I introduced you at the beginning of the show as an illustrator. Is that enough? Does that suffice as a job description for you?
On the one hand, it definitely describes what I do. It has definitely broadened in the last couple of years. I'm not gonna like lose sleep over like my job description. It definitely has changed in that regard, that I used to illustrate a lot of articles where I had to put in my 2 cents in what I did, but where ultimately my task was to make something else, like a given topic, shine one way or another. And it has changed in so far that now I'm really more into storytelling and also generating the content and saying like, this is the story that I want to tell. So in terms of the tools that I use, it's still very much the same, constantly evolving. But in terms of the actual assignments, it's more assignments that come out of myself.
And let's talk a little bit about your mood while you're working, because it's interesting. I've talked about tears and I've talked about laughter, and with you, I have the sense that there are 2 mood poles, and one of them is agony and one of them is ecstasy, and you sort of swing between the two, and there's not an awful lot in between.
Well, it's like a 95% swing to the agony and only like a 5% swing to the ecstasy. No, because ultimately, I feel that the ecstasy is like what the reader is supposed to experience, or the fun, or the laughter. And my job is to make it maybe look like it was done in fun and ecstasy. But sadly, in my experience, in order to make something look effortless, it takes an awful lot of effort.
And just to follow on with that thought, there's one wonderful quote from you. I really liked it very, very much indeed. Creativity is like chasing chickens. Can you follow through on that thought, please?
Well, that thought really comes from Rocky 1, from that moment when Rocky is practicing and the coach says, like, here, just catch the chicken. Something that looks relatively not only easy, but only like almost like benign. It turns out to be not only incredibly hard, but also extremely unsexy, really. It's not like a grand, like running through the mountains or lifting a gigantic rock. It's just, it looks pretty desperate. And the problems... The second problem is you can't do like half an effort. You have to go all the way, because like that chicken is not going to give you half a leg if you kind of run a little too slow. Unless you kind of go full throttle, there's no chance for success.
I have to ask you, have you ever chased a chicken in real life?
I have not chased a chicken, but the movie seemed real enough that I felt I can draw that conclusion.
I can boast that I have chased a chicken. Yeah?
Successfully?
Successfully, yeah. I have mentioned that you are more successful, I think it's fair to say, you're very, very, very successful in the US, and slightly less well-known here in Germany. That's ironic, and it demands an explanation. It might just be because of your, the way you've lived your life so far, and it might have something to do with the way your trade is seen here in Germany and seen in the US.
It probably has something to do with just like the amount of work that I'm capable of doing. And I get more and more requests here in Germany. The problem is I only have so many hours in the day and so many kind of like mental capacities that I can only fill so many pages with things. I have worked in the States a lot longer, and I have some clients that I continue to work there for. So obviously, my drawings probably are better known there. It's starting to slowly change. And of course, with the internet and everything, things blend. When I do something for the New Yorker, people see it here as well. And I definitely think that that's actually going to accelerate in the coming years, that this idea of working for one country or one kind of cultural entity is less and less relevant.
Christoph Niemann, we're going to go back to your early days now, and the story goes that when you were, I don't know what, 3, 4 years old, you said, "I want pencils."
I asked for pencils. I don't think I had to fight too hard. I think my parents were more than willing to kind of pass them on to me and my brother.
Your brother, yeah? It's interesting that you mentioned him, because I read that he was the more talented one initially with the pencils in question.
Well, I asked for them. I started it, and he was a ton better than me, which I found really sad. I think I was like the harder worker eventually. So we were just like ongoing struggle.
That's one of the themes of your life, I find, sort of perseverance, hard work, staying focused, yeah?
No, and on the one hand, sometimes I feel I deserve to have more fun when I work. I have a great job, so why can I just not go to work every day and have a jolly good time? On the other hand, of course, it makes it actually more predictable in a sense that if you can't kind of break through, you know the only way you can get there is you just try harder, and eventually it's going to happen. Which which somehow is like more. It's nicer to know that there's that way rather than waiting for the golden moment where the thing just drops from the sky.
Okay, so when you were younger, I want to go back to you being a youngster, maybe a teenager, yeah? You may or may not have been fascinated in, I don't know what, rock bands, the kind of conventional thing that teenagers are interested in. Were you also, did you have illustrators who you were already looking to emulate?
I started with Tommy Ungerer, the fantastic French children's book author. I went to Asterix and Obelix when I was like 5 to, I would say, 10, 11, and then went all out Mad Magazine for probably a solid decade, with, I would say, Don Martin and Mort Drucker, who did the movie spoofs, as my kind of golden heroes. Okay,
so you were good at school, I gather. You're pretty good at school. Yeah. Okay, you can admit it, yeah, on TV, that you were good at school, yeah. In the town of Weiblingen, that I've never visited.
No, that's where I was born. I grew up a few miles through the woods there.
Okay, and nearby is the city of Stuttgart. You went to art college in the city of Stuttgart, and that was extremely important. You didn't go far here, but you were tutored by somebody called Heinz Edelmann, a bit of a legend.
Quite a bit of a legend. He's probably most known for the art direction of and the drawings for Yellow Submarine, the Beatles movie.
That's iconic stuff.
That was actually something that he almost like disowned. He's done like a huge amount of fantastic book cover work, poster work, illustration and design work that is like among, like when I came to New York for the first time, people were like, oh, the great Heinz Edelmann, which definitely didn't hurt. So he was really quite a legend.
You went off to New York. That was the next step in your journey. First of all, you went to Stuttgart, not very far. Then you went to New York, yeah? You didn't know anybody in New York, and you were traveling very light.
I was traveling very light. I had my portfolio, and I had a bag of quarters, and it was really... I had written letters, but ultimately it was like standing at a Grand Central Station at one of these payphones, not really understanding what they were saying because my English was too bad and the connection was really bad, and then just like hoping that means, yes, come by next Tuesday and show us your book.
Tell us about your initial successes, because that must have been very, very exciting for you. You go to a completely new country. You have to understand a new mentality to be able to comment on it, to be able to illustrate life there, and you were successful.
Well, it was fantastic. The first time you have a drawing published, of course, is an incredible moment. I was still an intern, and I got a call from Rolling Stone, fantastic art director Fred Woodward at the time, who said, do this record review for me. And they sent me the CD, and I listened to the CD, and it was all about yeah, yeah, baby, yeah. So I didn't really have anything to go on. I was absolutely desperate. I actually made a final overnight, like then made a sketch of the final, sent that in because I was too afraid my sketch wouldn't work out. And they said, yeah, no, sure, it's fine. And I assumed they mean it's terrible and we assign somebody else. And then I ended up back in Stuttgart, I ended up running to the International Bookstore every week, just freaking out. And then 3 weeks later, it was actually in there. That was a pretty special moment.
Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Good for you. Now, let's make a great big leap forward to a little bit more closer to what you're doing now. Let's have a look at some images from one of your most recent projects called Petting Zoo. Yeah, we'll have a look at those, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here, Christoph.
So this is an interactive app called Petting Zoo, and the idea behind it was that I sometimes look at drawings and I felt like, what if you could just like touch the drawing and the drawing would do something? And that was the plan behind this. The problem was that as I started working on it, I thought there must be an application for this. There must be something where I just feed my drawings into and say, can I tap or swipe right? And then it will kind of trigger the movements. There wasn't. So the first step in this, what I found at the end being a very creative project, was just sitting there typing endless lines of code of numbers and letters and commas into the computer, which was difficult to say, to put it mildly.
You've always been very open to what I mean is called in the cliche a mixed media approach from your very early days, really. No?
I was very open, and it was never really an excitement for media per se. It was never, oh, there's a computer, there's great filters, how can that influence my work? I always saw it as, wow, there's a piece of technology, and now I can do that thing that I always dreamed of, and I can do it cheaply, faster, more perfectly. I think I spent 10 years of my youth just trying to do flat color. I wanted to have like a black outline filled with red. And it never works. Like no matter what marker you use, it's always cloudy or weird or imperfect. And when the computer came along, bling, you have this like perfect red flag. And so also, it's similar with this app where I found I always wanted to do this kind of project, and now I have the tools and the possibilities to do it with very few resources.
Something else that you've been doing, which is extremely interesting, was actually a work that was given to President Barack Obama when he came here to Germany on his state visit earlier this summer. I think we can have a look at that, I think, and just tell us a little bit about that, because that's fascinating as well.
Yeah, this is a print I did, and I got a call from the chief of protocol from the president's office on the morning when Barack Obama was supposed to arrive. And
on the very morning? On
the very morning, and they were like, oh, we're not quite happy with the presence that we have so far in our collection. Do you have something there? And I looked through my flat files, and I saw that poster, and I felt that on the one hand it was something really about kind of creativity in New York, but I felt it's actually quite a nice metaphor for diplomacy and the difficulties, and how sometimes a difficult situation might actually end up in a good way.
Interesting. Now, that leads us along very nicely, because when Barack Obama last visited Germany, it was this summer, I just mentioned it, the mood between Berlin and Washington was, I think it's fair to say, still amicable. Much, though, has happened since then. Revelations and more revelations that the American security services have been gathering all sorts of information on German citizens and even spied on Chancellor Angela Merkel. Well, it's left many people here in Germany wondering how much they can trust a country that is meant to be one of this country's closest allies. There's a big problem here. Yeah? How would you define the problem?
Well, on the one hand, of course, it's a problem of trust and really friendship between countries and what you can and cannot do legally in terms of international treaties. The aspect that freaks me out probably more than the idea of wiretapping Merkel or not is really the global implication. There were some reactions on the American side after this that kind of said like, oh, come on, guys, everybody does it. Don't be naive.
Get real.
Get real. Which also I almost found like had a little bit of a kind of bring it on quality. It's like, if you were good enough to do this with us, you would do it as well. There was what I read as kind of like the subline, and that I found incredibly dangerous and stupid, because I think ultimately, especially America will always depend, there will be situations where America will depend on the goodwill of the people to make really tough international political decisions. And these will be the moments where this kind of behavior will come back to haunt not them, but all of us, I think. And that's something where I feel it's not really worth doing all these things to hurt a much larger cause. And that is something that worries me more, even though everything that the NSA is doing there is really worrisome. But that's like a larger thing that I think will be a long and sadly interesting story.
You're clearly worried, and I am too. I would have it on a very personal level by these developments. I'm wondering whether, if I retrace your development, we went through your development a little bit. I guess you were living in New York at the time of the 9/11 attacks on New York and elsewhere. Does that shape does that give you a greater insight into the pattern that is emerging here? The way that America felt attacked, has felt attacked, and has responded?
I doubt it would really mean that I have a larger understanding. Strangely for me, I was there, I had just married, my wife was pregnant at the time, so it was a very, very personal moment.
Very intense. Yeah.
It was very intense, and for me it was almost more like, oh, now I understand what the older generation in Europe was always talking about. Standing there, knowing you're vulnerable, and also knowing I was in the city, my studio was like half a mile up from ground zero, so that was for me. They meant me when they did that, me personally, not me theoretically. And that changes your worldview, but it doesn't, like these moments in New York were actually these weeks afterwards, even in America. I mean, there were demonstrations in Tehran, like pro-American demonstrations. They were politically actually really fascinating, and as much as in a situation something can be beautiful, these were actually beautiful moments of coming together. And it started turning weird, like months later, where you realize like the strong, big political gears came into motions, and the government at the time really trying to fulfill an agenda that had nothing to do with that, based on these events. And I think ever since, it's hard to separate the two. I think that the whole terrorism threat is real, and it will be a lot of, like most of it will probably be with computers and with attacking water plants from a laptop.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the fact that there's an NSA is probably justified.
Interesting thoughts, yeah. Let's change gear just a slight little bit, because we're talking, there are two cities in your life at the moment. I mean, we've had Stuttgart and that area that you come from originally, but you live in Berlin, you used to live in New York. Let's talk about your relationship to New York. You did something very, very interesting. You ran in I think it was the 2011 marathon, yeah? And I don't quite know how. We've got some images for what you did, and maybe you can explain to me what is going on, because I find it totally bewildering. In fact, there we go, Christoph.
I had watched the marathon as a spectator in New York, and I found it to be like the most emotional sports moment that I ever experienced. And I thought, once in my life I want to run it, and I felt the perfect excuse to run it is if I turn it into a job. And the most insane way of turning this into a job was to actually draw it while running it. So I combined.
Did you draw while you were running?
I drew while I was walking. No, everything had to be in motion. It was very important. So I ran, thought about an idea, then I would slow down to a walking pace, but actually doing all the writing and drawing while I was walking.
So you were doing the drawings, you were actually taking a photo of the drawings?
Yes.
You were...
And then uploading them to Twitter, because it needed to be very real and social media. And it was fascinating to afterwards see the reaction, and then as I progressed in the race, more and more people knew who I was. At the beginning was like, oh look, there's somebody writing a book, and at the end people actually knew, oh, he's the guy illustrating.
I know you're pretty fit. I know you run here in Berlin quite regularly. And as somebody who runs a bit and has run a marathon in my time, yeah, I'm curious, are you going to share with us the time you ran while you were doing all this stuff?
I did 6 hours 10 when I did that. Okay. I ran a little faster when I only ran the race here. I want to get the competition part out of this, and really I actually assumed that at the end I would ride over the finish line with the bus that takes all the people who don't quite make it at the end.
Exactly. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about something very different now, something called synesthesia. It's a neurological condition sometimes described as a blending of the senses. So somebody with synesthesia might hear a certain piece of music and it puts a certain taste in their mouth, or perhaps more commonly, they might see a certain colour, and then they'll see at the same time a letter of the alphabet. Now, Christoph can tell us more about this shortly. He knows much more about it than I do.
I definitely know about this idea of connecting colors to letters and numbers. Something I always had. I had discussions with my brother. I said A is obviously dark green, and he would say, no, it's red. And I was like, no, this is absolutely not true. And the problem ultimately for creative work, of course, is it doesn't really have that much of an impact because it's a very personal thing. In my world, letters and numbers are connected with colors, but if I told you, if I showed you like a bee that's orange, you wouldn't laugh about it because you probably don't know that a bee is supposed to be blue, as it is.
If I were to say, if we were to spend time, if we were to meet on a train, for example, and we were to chat with each other for 2 hours, would I notice in that time that you are synesthetic? Yeah.
I doubt it, and I think at this point we probably all are, and we're all trained to be synesthetic. When you look at the logo of a brand, when you drink a certain drink, you think of the logo, or like even with phones, when you have a phone from a certain telecom provider, they will like have their certain jingle. So we're actually, I think by now it's really like a part of like the media world to kind of have this whole universe of sound and image and visuals that they're supposed to give us an idea of that thing that we're supposed to love and buy.
I'm really fascinated by how you see yourself in the situation, because at what age did you realise, there's something about me? I mean, you're saying that, we're all, to an extent, synesthetic, but I don't know.
But for me, there was never a question that, especially like the connection from letters and numbers to color. So when I thought of a number, I thought, okay, our home number is purple, green, gray, blue, gray, blue.
Really?
And that actually helped me remember numbers or names. And sometimes even if I wouldn't really remember the name, I would still know it was kind of like in the greenish blue area. And then I knew it could not be George, because that would be red and white.
That's absolutely fascinating. Have you got a good memory?
Decent. It like fails me at times. I hope it's practicable, so I probably should practice it a little bit more.
Because when I was reading up on the subject and trying to find out, what it's all about, it was said that not only does it run in families, but that people, the people like you, have, generally speaking, have excellent memories. A great resource.
Sometimes I wish it was like more prevalent.
We've talked about New York. We've talked about Berlin. You made the choice, 5 years ago? 5 years ago, to come from New York to Berlin. Why did you make that choice?
I did not want to do it for the kids, because I always felt when you do something for the kids, it's something that eventually, if you don't like it, you might always go like, oh, and everybody, of course, always goes like, oh, so you did that for the family. For me, having moved from Germany to New York was an incredibly scary but also energizing move. Like, to go into a different culture, into a different city, is something that's very confusing, but it rewires you almost. And eventually I had this decision with my wife to say, let's do this again. She's German, she moved to New York, we met there, and we both said we want to have another moment in our life where we are slightly disoriented and be in a new place, having to completely reinvent ourselves. And also see what that does with my work. Whether like the different environment in Berlin would kind of change my approach, something like it's less kind of like perfection-oriented here than I would see it in New York.
That's interesting. We'll talk about that in just a second, because that is a very interesting aspect of that decision that you made, I know. Now, there's no doubt about it, if you're going to experiment, Berlin is a good place to do it. Berlin is booming, and it's drawing in people in all sorts of creative sectors, just like Christoph Niemann. Now, many of them don't want to be stuck on their own, of course. They want to be rubbing up against other creative types. So what they do is they join what is called, and here's one of those great big long German words, a Bürogemeinschaft, which is the German word for office sharing. You work in a shared office situation, but you don't exactly have 3 people at 3 desks in one room or anything like that, do you?
Not quite. I used to work by myself. It's a given. You start out, you just like work essentially in your bedroom. And I've always found it perfectly efficient. The problem is I always started working really in my underpants and T-shirt. And then you kind of skip breakfast, you start to kind of like work, and you find yourself at 2 o'clock in the afternoon still being kind of like essentially...
Bad social habits.
Bad social habits. But the bigger problem I realized was I would be on important phone calls. And particularly in that place, I had to sit underneath my desk because the phone reception was better down there. So I had this conference call with a group of people in California. And I had to talk about like the creative vision for the company or something. And I'm sitting there in underpants, under my desk, under cables. And I realized that this tension from the image I tried to project to my actual physical situation right now kind of created some personal tension, and that eventually I might have to find a situation where I'm fully dressed with a cup of coffee, walking somewhere, saying good morning to people, and that might be beneficial to me. So I changed that very soon after.
You came to Berlin, you said, we need to go back to that point, because you wanted to learn new tricks. That was one quote I saw. What sort of new tricks have you learned?
Well, it was also like the idea of not doing too many tricks, because when you're in a place like New York where everything's deadline, efficiency, you don't start a book and then you don't finish it. So you become very good about seeing problems before they happen, navigating around them. Yeah. And the new tricks was really to just like take a mistake or a problem head on and just see what happens if I do something where I'm actually not sure whether I can finish it or not.
That's interesting. You're talking about, or certainly the way New York is perceived from outside as being this very busy, buzzy place. New York has a buzz, there's no doubt about that. Berlin has a buzz, yeah? Which city has the bigger buzz? You can judge.
Well, no, I think they're both a little too big and too diverse, fortunately, in order to really change that, to decide which one has the bigger buzz. I found New York to be a place that's just so high-strung in a really fantastic sense that if you want to get something done, in my experience, there's no better place than that. I think it can be a little stifling eventually, because you're so busy producing and getting things done and avoiding to make mistakes that sometimes I find it difficult to replenish your kind of creative tank. And that was maybe the biggest goal with the move here.
That's interesting. OK, let's change. We don't have that much time left, and we like to ask our guests here on the show to bring along a treasured possession or something that is particularly interesting for you. And you've made a very unusual choice, I have to say. Yeah.
No, this is
explain, Christoph.
This is a hammer of a piano, and well, I know technically what a hammer looks like. I started playing the piano 5 months ago. I used to always play a little bit, but I now have a piano teacher. I go to a music school, and I have half an hour a week where I learn to read from score. And it's incredibly hard, but what it has allowed me is to really to have time off, have mental time off, because when I read or when I run, when I draw, I always think about other things. When I play the piano, it's so incredibly difficult, and I'm so terribly bad at it, that there's no room for any other thought. And so I found that extremely liberating. The problem came when the vanity mixes in, and like now I'm sitting there at night playing the piano, and I had a glass of wine, which you're not supposed to put on the piano, as I learned. I did, and of course it fell into the piano, and my moment of beautiful cultural kind of self-image just like fell apart, and I was like taking the piano apart within minutes, and then with Q-tips kind of like trying to clean. And that's when I realized you can take a piano apart actually quite easily.
That tells us an awful lot about the kind of guy you are, don't you think?
Yeah.
OK, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that story with us.
I hope my kids are not going to, because they're absolutely forbidden to have any food or drinks near the piano.
We're going to wrap up now with our traditional Talking Germany quiz at the end of the show. Yeah, I'll give you two to choose from. Yeah, Berlin cool or New York hip?
Neither. For me, neither.
You reject the concept completely and utterly. Running or walking?
Running.
Running, yeah. You run twice a week here in Berlin, I know, yeah. If there were a global election, would you vote for Barack Obama or Angela Merkel?
Well, considering that they represent a grand total of 8% of the world population, probably, I think neither of them would be a good choice. At this point, Merkel might be a little bit more popular on the global scale, but...
Handmade art or digital art?
Ultimately, always handmade.
Handmade, yeah, despite your fascination for the digital
world? It's the pencil on paper or the ink on paper, which is still the greatest thrill, and nothing else will top that.
Are your kids your biggest fans or your biggest critics?
Depending on their mood.
And we're going to come full circle. What's more important to you, getting people to laugh or getting people to think?
Thinking is the greater achievement.
You're You're so right, yeah. That is your lot with the entertaining and philosophical Christoph Niemann. There's more Talking Germany, including my blog and our archive on our website. You might also like to watch the German version of the show. That's Typisch Deutsch with Hajo Schumacher. For now, bye-bye and